Seven, six, five, four, three, two, one.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So, hello everyone, and today we're welcoming author historian Michael Livingston to talk about his book. I've got it right here. It's absolutely fantastic. Crecy, Battle of Five Kings. How are you doing, Michael?
I'm doing great, man. Thank you for your kind words. Thanks for having me on.
No, it's okay. Like more than okay. You know, I've finished reading your book this past week, and I am in love with it. I think it's a fantastic piece of scholarship, and I'm excited to dive into it with you.
Oh, awesome. Well, I'll talk about it for however long you need to.
Oh, well, that's brilliant then. Yeah. So the first question I want to ask you, and I ask this to every guest who comes onto the podcast, what inspired you to write this book?
So this particular book kind of goes back, God, like a decade or more. I visited Crecy not intending to write on it at all. I was visiting Agincourt, and I had some questions about how Agincourt had happened, and they're right next to each other. And so I was with a couple colleagues of mine, Kelly DeVries, who's a phenomenal historian, and Robert Wisdom Savage, who's now retired but was with the Royal Armories. And so we went down to Crecy because Kelly had some questions about how that battle was reconstructed. And in the process of that, I mean, I was there like an hour, and I was like, this just isn't right, man. Like this is so fundamentally flawed. What's happening here? And began doing the research of, let me look at the sources. Let me see what they actually say. And that led to what's called the Battle of Crecy, a casebook, which Kelly and I did together, which tried to find and translate, re-edit all of the sources of the 14th century about this battle. Battle happened in 1346. And in the process of that, we started finding a lot of stuff that seemed to be in error and needing to be done again. And so that's where this comes from.
It's really interesting to see you go on that process of reconstructing the battle, trying to correct misconceptions with it. And why did you think it was, or why did you feel, I think it's more of a feeling there, why did you feel it was important to correct that misconception about the battle?
Well, obviously there's just, when you're doing history, as you all know, and you find something wrong, you're like, well, it's time to get the pitchforks, let's get this right. So, on the one level, it's just, let's get it right. This particular battle, it holds a very central place in English mythology, English nationalism, and even the relationship between England and France. And, it's incredibly pivotal for what happens in the 100 Years of War. And so I felt really like we got to get this one right. Stands the nexus of so many things. You need to understand what happened here. And to see, kind of fundamental problems with what we thought happened. I mean, for me, very personally, I'm one of my mantras. Every book, it gets said at least once, is like, a battle is its ground. And so if you don't have the right ground, what do you have? So I was really dedicated to get that right. But just even on the reconstruction, the course of the battle, right? What happened with the Black Prince here? What happened to the French? Why did they lose so badly? For so long, I think most people were just on the English side anyway. English historians even were like, well, they lost because they were French. Let's just move on. And I'm like, that's not how anything works, guys. Let's figure this out. And I guess on the sort of good side, look, I'm an American. I don't have a dog in this fight. I don't know. I just want to know what happened, right? It's nothing to me. So I just tried to get it right, and as I say, I want to be right. I want to get it right, and working on the casebook with Kelly and others, we had extraordinary insights and sort of this pile of academic stuff. and I was very keen to try and bring that to a popular audience, not just the facts, but try to sort of help readers understand how we got there, right? Like how does one do this? I don't want to just tell you here's where the battle was, but like here's why I think that. Here's how I put that together. So you can check my work, and if you disagree, cool. Or if you can apply that to some other battle, go for it.
And I really liked seeing that thought process throughout the book and the building of the picture for Crecy. But you mentioned something really interesting. I find really interesting in your building of the picture for the Hundred Years' War and for Crecy. And you mentioned how you see the events of 1066 as being the roots for this war. Now, that's not something I've conventionally seen about this. So why do you see 1066 as the root?
Look, I could be wrong. I don't think I am. But when you kind of think about, how does this even start, right? I mean, this starts with the core problem of having a king in England who owes allegiance of some kind to the King of France, and that's 1066. Like that's the outcome of that, right? That William the Conqueror comes along, beats at Hastings, beats Harold Godwinson, becomes King of England, but he's still Duke of Normandy back home. I mean, in fact, to him, it looks like he thinks that's the bigger deal, being Duke of Normandy, because when he's buried, that's where he asks his body to be taken, and he gives to his eldest son, he gives the dukedom. So this idea of kind of a trans channel presence, and the complication of that, and when it comes to the French king, that's 1066 that launches that. I try in this book to give, without getting into crazy details, but to give people this sort of ebb and flow of that dynamic, and how complicated it was by different events, right? The fact that you have the King of England marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine is pretty big in that. That again sort of happens because of something that happens, in the chain of history. So I try to give everybody what those pieces of the puzzle are. But, if you're going to mark a starting point for this essential political problem, it's 1066 to me. And obviously by the time we're getting to 1346, it's armies in the field, and we're going to, lots and lots and lots and lots of people are going to die, right? They're going to die at Crecy, and then they're going to die at Agincourt, and they're going to die at Poitiers, and they're going to die like all the way to the end, before the French finally win and end this essentially for good. So, yeah, I find that historical context is important, and I think necessary, right? For us to kind of have that long view of history before we get into the nitty gritty details, as I do, of like, we need to look at this hill, like that's a different level of detail, but getting up to that granular stuff, I think you need to take the long view.
Looking at that long view, there's quite a few English kings and French kings in that period, and there's an ebb and flow of the strength of personality across those two monarchies. How do the two kings manage that relationship of one being the liege lord and one being the lord in a different kingdom, but being a king in the other? You've already alluded to it being quite a difficult thing for people such as William of Normandy to manage.
Yeah, they don't do it well. I mean, it's like this becomes a war, right? And it's a war. The book I'm writing right now, so we're talking about Crecy, and then the book that came out last November was Agincourt. The book I'm writing right now is basically redefining the 200 Years' War, and I started much earlier. I actually started in 1292, because our traditional dates, I think, are mistaken. But I could have started it even earlier than that, right? The Angevin War. It's the same thing going on, right? It's the same like how are you in charge of me when I'm a king and nobody should be in charge of me? And like it's the same dance, and a lot of it's egos. And some of the kings are able to, on both sides, are able to navigate that better, right? Either on the French side, being able to say, look, I'm not going to make a big deal out of this. Just check the boxes, man, and let's just move on. Versus sometimes on the English side, being like, I'm not gonna check any box you put in front of me. How dare you? And the spectrum in there of responses is absolutely up to these personalities, right? Um, and it's up to the personalities around them. So, Edward the First, he's furious about this from the drop, because his dad kind of capitulated to all of this in signing the Treaty of Paris, and from the start, he's like, oh, I want that undone. I don't want that to be okay ever again. Well, that's in large part because like his ego. Edward's not a like wilting flower. He's gonna come in hot, and that's what he does, and kind of sets things up then for what becomes 100 Years of War. So yeah, these personalities, these kind of integral folk at the top are making a massive difference for how this evolves, and they themselves are not ever in a vacuum, right? You also have other lords around them, right, who are saying, you need to to get rid of those people, right? You need to fight, you need to be stronger, you need to like do this, do that. And with the kind of interplay of those dynamics and economics, I mean, it's all complicated. I try to tell a streamlined story of that's going to help readers see how big and complicated this is and long lasting it is, without like, we don't have to get in too much into the weeds. I just need you to kind of have the basic understanding of this interplay, and how many things are pushing them to go to war.
I think that holistic understanding of how they go to war is really crucial, because often people think it is just those two power players, the King of England, King of France, but there are advisors around them. But you mentioned the Treaty of Paris there. Could
Yeah,
you
man.
give us some context around that? What is the Treaty of Paris, and why is it such an important document in this war?
So the Treaty of Paris does a number of things. The main kind of impetus of what it's doing is it's shutting off what had been the 100 Years War, the sort of nascent 100 Years War. Sometimes it's called the first 100 Years War, the Angevin conflict, whatever you want to call it. All that business that comes after Eleanor of Aquitaine and all that. It shuts all that down and says, okay, all right, here's the rules, everybody. Like, here's the corners, here's the border, here's what's necessary to maintain the peace. And the kind of key, well, there's so many key factors in what's happened in this treaty, but I think the main one to sort of remember is that it codifies the relationship. It says, look, the English can hold these lands, but they're holding it in fealty. Like, you must do homage. You have to do homage to the French king. Like, here's the checklist of things you have to do, and that comes with certain other things, right? If you're doing homage to the French king, it means that at least for those lands, you're saying he's sovereign, and that's something Edward, for example, is not keen to do. I have no sovereign because I'm Edward, right? So the Treaty of Paris basically lays a landscape that is meant to stop everything, but in fact just has encoded into it the reasons for them to keep fighting. And so that's like, it's inevitable essentially that this will continue as soon as the ink is dried, and that's in fact what happens. And I said, 1292, I think it blows up, starts blowing up again, and once again you have these ebbs and flows until it really ignites for good, right? Right. With the so-called 100 Years War. But it really is all kind of encapsulated right in that treaty that is has within it the means of its own destruction, essentially, because it's asking people to do and agree to something that the initial men who signed that treaty were happy to do, but nobody coming after them was happy to have in place, right? For them, it was, this is an affront. I'm not going to go along with that. That lessens me, right? And somehow, and it's not, again, it's not just the kings, it's everybody else involved there. And when you add in the international trading routes that are now getting involved with the wool trade and wine, and there's too much at stake, and too many people wanted to only have it their way, right? And that in human history tends to involve people trying to kill each other, and that's what we get here.
It's another one of those perfectly sound medieval treaties, but
Totally.
yeah, it is quintessentially medieval, I think, in terms of their approach to treaty making. But you mention a war, and I think I kind of want to give some space to this war because it sounds incredibly fascinating and helps us understand it. It's the War of San Sardos. So how is that important to us to understand this war and what comes after it?
The War of San Sardos is such a dumb war. It really, no offense to anybody who's ancestors died there or something like that. It's such a kind of silly thing, yet it is part of this march towards war, right? What happens in San Sardos is there are these lines, and you're on the English side, this is the French side, and you have to do homage this way. Because of that, English only holding lands in, say, Gascony. That's where San Sardos and everything happens. The ultimate judicial authority is the King of France. So you could appeal your case to the court in Paris, right? So it's going to go to the Estates General and such. It's all going to go to Paris. Well, the War of San Sardos, an abbot who runs an abbey, and there's a kind of smaller abbey that he's also kind of a corollary satellite thing, and it's on the other side. He's on the French side, it's on the English side. Man, this is complicated. How about if the one on the English side also does the French stuff, so I'm not having to deal with two tax systems and two of this and two of that. I'm just simplify my life. And it's a Jonathan Sumption calls it a lawyer's delight, I think is his phrase, which is just fantastic coming from Sumption. Because it lasts for years before a decision is made. The decision is finally made. Yeah, sure, that sounds fine. Well, it also happens that this place that he wants to have kind of under French authority is a pretty good military strategic location. And so a French sergeant goes and puts up a standard, we're going to fortify this place. And the local English don't like that. And so they kill that man and hang him up by that standard. And pretty much everybody's like, well, I guess we're going to go to war. And the English are remarkably not prepared for it. Stunningly unprepared for it. It gets steamrolled. Just get absolutely steamrolled. To the point they're barely holding on to a few cities on the coast, Bordeaux, Bayonne, and a little strip of land between them before we get a ceasefire. And, so coming out of that is this sort of well, let's everybody back to their corners. There's some more land gets traded to the French. So now the English have this grudge that they have less than they had before. They've been forced into this new treaty they don't like. But again, none of it erases the essential problem. They're still but let's just go back to that rule set that just failed, right? It just didn't work. Let's do that. And sure, everything will be fine. And of course it's not fine. Then you have the next thing that pops up. And so it's this kind of anomalous, it's not anomalous in the fact that it's one more in the sequence of fights between England and France. But it mostly gets ignored. People think that Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry and everything that's happening back there is amazing, because it is. And then you get Edward III and everything that's happening, Crecy, Poitiers, Calais, amazing. Yes, totally. But smack dab in the middle is this other war between them that definitely shows that sort of progression, right? And it's a progression of this bad thing happened. We got everybody to settle down, but nobody has forgotten the damages that were done, right? So the next time there's a fight, they're like, well, you know what? I have been saving up my anger from that thing, and now we're going to take you out for that too. And this is something we see throughout the 100 Years' War. Is this like, well, you did that thing to my daddy, and I'm going to make sure that you get your comeuppance for that. So that nobody can kind of like leave the past behind. You're constantly living and fighting the present in light of everything that happened in the past, and that never ends well, and it doesn't end well here either.
And that grievance-based
Yeah.
approach to war can be quite difficult to track and look at. But so we see that the English weren't particularly prepared for Saint-Sardos. How prepared were both France and England for the start of the actual 100 Years' War?
Not well. Again, this is not like, in one sense, kind of nobody wants it to happen. Everybody wants it to happen. Nobody wants it to happen. The active sort of preparation that you would think of as military buildup relative to the scale of what happens is not a match. It is a case where even when Edward III proclaims, I'm the King of France. I mean, that's an offensive, provocative thing to say. I'm the king of your country and you're not king of it anymore. That is a declaration of war. And even when he does that, he's not the one who takes the fight to their side first. The French take the fight to him first. He's not ready to make good on that threat, to make good on that promise. It's the enemy who's like, oh, really? And they evade the coastal raids along the English Channel. So they kind of fire the first shots in that regard. But not that they were like ready to invade England either, right? They're not ready to do that. So this is a kind of, the 100 Years' War entire is a conflict that's also caught in the space between kind of militia-based systems of fighting and standing army-based systems of fighting, and what it takes to support those things, and national taxation policies, and national all those things that we kind of think of as militarized warfare now are to some degree in flux during the 100 Years' War, right? It's one of the many things that makes this period itself fascinating, is that you are seeing almost like the development of these social ideas of warfare because of what's happening, right? Like, oh my gosh, maybe we need that, so we have to invent that thing. And then, of course, in the middle of it, you'll have gunpowder showing up, right? So we start with one kind of warfare and we end with very different sorts of fights because gunpowder shows up and changes everything. So, yeah, this is as a period, a fight that sort of nothing stays constant, right? I mean, of course, as I say in the book, look, nobody who was there at the beginning was there at the end, right? It's nobody lived that long. It's generational, and as each generation adds as you said, its grievances, and then deals with the technological change and tactical change and strategic interests and the changing of how our ships can run on the water. I mean, like, everything changes over the course of this, except that they want to keep fighting. Like, that doesn't change. That keeps going. So yeah, it becomes a really amazing conflict. And again, in the book, this just takes us up to Crecy, which is really, really early in the fight, right? This is 1346. So really just kind of, I just kind of tried to lay the groundwork for, helping people see in a real basic sense. This is not a sort of a dry academic kind of tome, as I write those kind of books too, but that's not this. This is like, hey, here's the action of what's happening.
Well, you really live in the dream, like writing both of them, really. But
I am. Oh, it's crazy. It's crazy. I love it.
well, you definitely seem like you enjoy writing about the action, and then talking about the action. Edward wants to start his Crecy campaign, but how does he plan it? Because these first few years, if you just alluded to, don't seem to go particularly well.
They don't. No, Edward the Third, when he kind of finally starts trying to do something, um, he's trying different avenues of attack. He's trying, in large measure, to use the Low Countries as a base of operations. He has allies in the Low Countries there because of the wool trade and lots of other kind of big social economic issues that were happening. But he's got a sort of base of operations there, and that's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to march an army in than to try and land an army in the enemy territory. So he tries to use that. It does not go well. He tries two of these invasions in the Low Countries. Both are failures. Now the English will say, "Oh, it's because the French were, you know, they weren't manly enough to come fight us or whatever." And then, like, what are you talking? What are you talking about? You're the one who invaded, failed, and ran away. I don't know what you're doing here. But that is kind of fun to me in that this is also a battle in which propaganda is there from the drop, and people are actively using it in the moment. Right? That Edward is writing these letters to the French. Well, I would have fought you anywhere. I just didn't wait for you because blah 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 blah. And you're like, well, that doesn't even make sense, man. If you were willing to fight anywhere, you should have just waited for me instead of running away. So you have all this happening. The first two are failures. The second, he's by that point getting close to going broke. His finances are a nightmare. Edward's finances are, and he's done very little damage to the French at this point. And then the Crecy campaign hits, and the Crecy campaign does not go the way he intended. This campaign, which I firmly believe is one of the great campaigns ever. I love this campaign. It's magnificent. That's not what he planned to do. This is like the Battle of Crecy is not. He did not plan to fight this battle. None of this went the way he planned it. And I don't say that to say like Edward's like bad at what he's doing. It's actually, isn't this all the more impressive? Like this, he was like building this thing as he was going, and this was the result. It's really, really pretty phenomenal. It has a lot in common with Agincourt in that regard, right? Henry V has no intention of fighting that battle, but when cornered, he does pretty darn good and wins at Agincourt. So yeah, this the planning of it. He recognizes he has to do kind of something a little different. At what point did he know he was even going to land in Normandy? We don't know. The French know he's sailing. They know he's got a massive army and he's sailing it. But nobody knows where he's going to land. They assume he's either going to go to the Low Countries, which is what he's done twice now and not worked well, or he's going to go down to Gascony and do it from there. So the fact that he lands instead on the Normandy coast meant nobody's ready for that. And it is within the realm of possibility. He doesn't know that, right? That as they're sailing, it's like, well, which way's the wind blowing? Let's just land there. It could have been that late in the day, but regardless, the end result is he's basically unopposed, right? When he makes his landing on the Normandy Peninsula and just begins steamrolling his way through Normandy. There's some attempts at kind of slowing him down, some actually kind of rather heroic attempts to try and slow him down, but the local authorities are not up to the task of stopping this big an army. When you have 10,000, 15,000 like men coming at you, like there's only, I'm going to knock down a bridge. Yeah, that'll slow them down, but they're going to rebuild the bridge. And sure enough, Edward is able to make huge headway, way faster, way further than I think he anticipates initially. it goes very well for him. That obviously then kind of introduces its own set of problems, but he does very well early on.
Yeah, it must have been quite intimidating for these local attempts to slow him down, going against this bigger army and possibly one of the best medieval generals. But you mentioned how the French don't really know what Edward's doing. Perhaps Edward doesn't really know what Edward's doing, but Edward seems to know quite well what the French might be doing. So how does he get to that point?
Yeah, he's got. I mean, it sort of depends on when you look, right? In the earlier campaigns, uh, you know, we don't know how he knows, but like he seems to know every plan that the French have, to the point that the French king is getting frustrated and is like, can I not like, you know, eat? Well, he says something like, "Can I not eat a meal without Edward being at the table?" Because Edward seems to have such good intelligence of what the French are doing. This when it comes to the Crecy campaign, Edward seems to be remarkably um, ignorant of what Philippe is doing and how quickly he's moving, because Edward takes the city of Caen rather unexpectedly. Comes to Caen. He's marched towards Caen. This is a sensible sort of destination and a sensible route of attack. But it's hardly any fight at all to take the city. Um, and he said like, oh my God, we just took the city. What? Like it's just this sudden precipitous thing. Mostly because the people of Caen decided to fight outside the walls, which is amazing. Would have been incredibly heroic if they hadn't turned and run at the first shots. and then the English are just like, well, let's just chase after them through the open doors and get into the city. And so they're able to sack the city. And now Edward has made tons and tons of cash. So much that he sends it all on his ships, the ships that brought him. He sends it all back to England. And he sends orders saying, well, how about when you guys get back to England, get reinforcements, more supplies, and meet me at the mouth of the Somme, the River Somme, which is like 150 miles away across land at this point as the crow flies. And he's, meet me there. He apparently thinks this is going so easily that he can just march there, right? He's going to march to the mouth of the Somme, pillage a bunch of stuff on the way, and get picked up. And then maybe march on to the Low Countries, and this will just be this kind of big march through a bunch of France. And got rich, he'll be able to pay off his creditors and do really well. And an incredibly kind of unwise thing to think, right? That he's going to be able to do this unopposed, essentially. And for someone who just a couple of years earlier knew exactly what the French king was doing, seems to have no idea that meanwhile the French king has positioned himself in Rouen, right in the middle of that road. And broken every bridge across the Seine. So he can't get across. And Edward seems to be shocked by this when he shows up and like, what? The king's on the other side of the river and they blocked and broke the bridges? Oh dear, what am I going to do now? And it's, I start talking in the book, Philippe, the French king, has a terrible reputation in history because of the loss at Crecy. But when you look at his actions, this is smart. Like, yeah, I don't have full strength yet because we didn't expect him here. So I'm having to gather my army. Well, all right. Block him off. Don't let him cross the river. Don't let him go where he wants to go. He's going to only have so much supplies, and we can starve him off. Right. And what's he going to do? He's going to have to march up the Seine, which gets him closer and closer to Paris, like the seat of our power. Like, okay, buddy, do it, right? March up to Paris. You can't get into Paris. There's no way you're going to like siege Paris. So yeah, this is a great move. Edward's totally, stymied by this, frustrated, and, trying to figure out what to do. And it's great. It's great generalship on Philippe's part. It's then great generalship on Edward's part that he managed to keep his army coalesced and, in this dire straits, maintain command and control. It's not good generalship that he's in that position, but he then does very well because of that, right? So you know, a sort of honest, objective look at these guys, you know, you have to admit the good and the bad. You know, that was, what were you thinking, Edward? That's not how anything's going to work. Now you're in a bad position. Hey, really good job dealing with that great, you know, that bad position. And that's what Edward does. And you see that throughout the campaign, and Philippe as well. Right? He's trying to do the best with a bad hand, and everything works for Philippe until it very much doesn't, right? And it all falls apart. But he was making the right moves for the most part.
And those moments before Edward crosses the Seine, you make it seem almost comical, where Edward's like, I'm here, Philip's here, and then they're just nowhere near one another. So how does that play into both of their strategies for Edward to cross and get to the mouth of the Somme, and Philippe to stop him?
Yeah, the basic strategy is don't let the English cross the river. Right, the Seine's a big river. You know, don't let him across. Keep him over there. He will kind of be using up his supplies, so he's going to get kind of weaker by the day. You meanwhile have forces coming up from Gascony, French forces. So there's going to be another army closing in on him. Eventually, Edward, looking for a way across, is going to keep going upstream. He'll run into Paris. He's not going through there. And we kind of got him stuck. It's sort of a hammer and anvil kind of situation. Edward's just trying to get through the day as we're going along. And this kind of, I don't really know, it's a cat and mouse game. It's just sort of frustrating day by day, up until, you know, the English are camped at Poissy. They're in the shadows of Paris. And that's where you get this flurry of letters going back and forth, in which they probably agree to do a pitched battle south of Paris. At least this is what the French think. The French think that Edward has agreed a set time. I mean, this is really like, you know, like a doctor's appointment. Like, we're gonna, like, this is the time. You know, show up 15 minutes early. Let's all get lined up, and then let's try and kill each other. That it's going to be that kind of arranged thing. And the French king marches south of Paris to Antony for this arranged battle, he believes. And that on the previous night, Edward manages to rebuild one of the bridges over the Seine and bolts north. So there's this kind of question of, did Edward agree to this in order to get Philippe to his side of the river, and then he rebuilds the bridge and bolts north, and is like, on the one hand, that's brilliant. Like, that is some like chess moves, brilliance. By the kind of moralities at the time, that would be incredibly dishonorable. Incredibly, and certainly goes against Edward's, like, you know, oh, I'll fight you anywhere kind of thing. That he's instead like hoodwinking him so that he can run away. We don't know, right? The French obviously say it one way. The English say, well, we never agreed to it. They misunderstood what we were saying, you know, because we wouldn't be so dishonorable. But I mean, one way or another, right? They cross the Seine. Edward does, and makes a shot north as fast as he can. He's not slowing down to pillage. He is just on a dead run to try and get to the mouth of the Somme, and to ultimately get to the Low Countries and safety. He just wants to get away, and he has Philippe at his tail the whole way, just hounding him. And then you get to the Somme, right? And there's no ships at the Somme. And the French have done the same darn thing. Let's block and break the bridges so he can't get across that. And Edward gets trapped again. And it's really brilliant part on the French. They really quite brilliantly trap him. And it's only this last second discovery of a ford that is only passable at low tide that enables the English to fight their way through the water in the Battle of Blanchetaque to get to the other side of the Seine. The Battle of Blanchetaque, which is one of the great escapes in history. It's amazing and like nobody remembers it because, like, the Battle of Crecy like happens right then, right? So there's this incredible battle, and Edward has been bought another kind of 24 hours, but in the end he can't get away and has to sit down. He gets essentially cut off and has to hunker down, find the best spot he can, as he's trapped, and it's a battle to the death, and that's Crecy.
I mean that battle of Blanchard is absolutely phenomenal. But that spot that you mentioned, how were you and your colleagues able to reconstruct and discover where this battle took place?
So, the first thing I will say is, I do not know where the Battle of Crecy happened. We won't know until we have archaeology. Until then, this is sort of a working theory, as it were. It's the only thing that I can find that makes any sense, but I don't have a literal smoking gun or broken arrow, I suppose would be the more appropriate analogy here. I don't have that. What we have is the case, and the case is, what do we know about where these armies were before the battle? What do we know about their rates of speed? How fast can they move? That gives you a search radius. And it gives you like two search radii, right? That sort of the overlap, the Venn diagram, if you will. That's probably where the battle is going to happen. You then have what the sources tell you. And the sources actually provide a great deal of very important information, and pretty consistent. I say pretty consistent. I mean, it's basically entirely consistent. They all say that the battle happened between the town of Crecy and the town of Abbeville. And the traditional site is not there. I think it's on the other side of Crecy. It's north of there. So all of our sources, including our eyewitness sources, they're saying it happened in between these two things, and it happened next to the forest. Well, that's not where the traditional battle site is. The traditional battle site, for Edward to be on that site, he would have had to capture the town of Crecy on Ponthieu. No source says that he does that. He would have needed to cross the small river there. No source says that he did that. And the position he took would make no tactical sense in terms of what the French do. The French actions, you truly do have to say, how did this battle happen the way it is? Well, because French are stupid. Like that's how you have to explain the battle. There's no way to look at that site and be like, oh, no, this was really clever. No, you have to basically just say, look, everybody on the French side, none of them knew how to fight. None of them knows how a battle functions. None of them can read the terrain. They just figure you just slam your head in a wall and eventually it'll break. And nothing about the history of those men shows that, right? And instead shows these very capable military leaders. So when you started kind of adding up all of that, what do our sources say about where it happened? What do they tell us about the terrain? What do the tactics that are being described, what do they look like? Where can all of that fit? And there's, for me, pretty much only one place that it fits. And it's on this position right beside the Forest of Crecy, in between Abbeville and Crecy on Ponthieu, where it ought to be, on high ground on the Mount de Crecy, which is what the French who were there, a dude who is collecting. He's trying to collect money for the horse that he lost. It's almost like an insurance claim. And it's like, where did you lose it? In the battle that happened on the Mont de Crecy. Like, he's like, that's where it happened. So it's no propaganda there. He's just wanting to get his money back. It's there. And when I started poring over maps of that area, then you started seeing funky things on toponyms, place names. Like, for instance, the place that, if the battle's there, this is how it would reconstruct. Well, the first wave of French, quote quote unquote French, I suppose, on that side to die are these Genoese crossbowmen, mercenary Genoese crossbowmen, all just get obliterated by the longbow. Well, the place where that would happen, if the battle is where I think it is, the place where that event would be has a location on it called the Garden of the Genoese in the middle of nowhere in northern France. That's a weird coincidence, right? And so you sort of pile up all of these things. And I think one of the mistakes a lot of people make is they think it's just one of those things, right? So there's a couple of British scholars who have collaborated on this attack to try and say, well, the Garden of Genoese is actually what is it? The Garden of Junipers. They think it's the Garden of Junipers. Well, that actually doesn't work for French linguistics. But even if it did, that's kind of irrelevant, right? It's just that's not like this is built on that. Like that's not built on that. So yeah, when you kind of put all these things together and the sum total of it, it's I think pretty likely that's where the battle happened. In fact, this summer, I have another article coming out that's going to. There's a whole nother piece of evidence that I haven't told anybody about, and it's coming out this summer, which is yet another no, it was there, guys. Like here's some more stuff that I couldn't put in the book because I didn't have it kind of nailed down, all the details of it. And I think it's important in history that you have these things nailed down, right? If in the same respect that I'm not going to say it's the Garden of Genoese until I've nailed down like that linguistically that's what the word is, right? The same kind of thing. So yeah, there's even more evidence than was in the book when I put it out. But yeah, you put all that together and you get a very different picture of this battle. What everybody is doing is making sense. You don't have to say, oh, the French are all just dumb. You don't have to say, oh, Edward he's just such a genius, that he worked all this out. No, he's great. He's doing a great job. So is everybody's doing the best job they can, right? Like, and that's what happens in a battle, right? Everybody's doing the best they can with the best knowledge they've got. And you start to see how it does go wrong, because it goes horrifically wrong for the French. And you start to see, what those errors were, right? Philippe does in the end lose this battle. Well, he doesn't lose it by ineptitude. He loses it by losing command and control of his army. That's a different thing. It's a different thing, and it looks very different at that point. So yeah, it is I think a fascinating battle. Again, just to kind of show like how does one figure this out, right? And what are the ramifications of that? But also the advantages of that, right? That having done that, what does that enable? Well, it enables you to understand history in this kind of like more, I think, meaningful and more powerful way.
No, I certainly agree. I think it's a very compelling case. You've definitely swayed me across to your side now. But it's a very compelling case as to where this battle is and the importance of the use of primary sources within history to create a case and to create a theory.
Yeah.
Now, we've discussed where the battle might be in your mind. What actually happens in the battle? You've alluded to a French defeat, alluded to Philippe losing control, but how does this become such a pivotal moment with it in English mythology?
So what happens is, Edward, he's quite cleverly taken the best position he can. He knows the kind of strategy he's going to do, which at this point is kind of, we sometimes call it the English standard. It becomes kind of standard because of this, but it's what they have done in a number of fights in the north of England and Scotland, which is going to have a dismounted center, men-at-arms, to receive a charge, and then wings of arrows on either side to funnel that charge, right? So you're going to pummel the French trying to charge you from the flanks, and then they're going to hit dismounted men preparing to receive them. So he knows he's going to do that. He knows he's outnumbered. So he finds a location that is kind of hemmed in. So it's going to, there's only so much frontage he has to control. He then takes the wagons he has, turns them on their sides to create a wagonburg, it's called. It's a field fortification, a makeshift wooden fort, essentially. And he's doing all this on the high ground. So it's high ground where it's penned in by trees, creates this wooden barrier to protect himself all the more. And has his archers hidden in the trees to right and left. So you can almost imagine this as this kind of big U or V or something like that, right? But flat at the bottom where his men-at-arms are. On top of that, he has left an opening in that wagonburg. There's a big opening in the middle, which that's not ideal, right? You don't leave a big opening in your fortification. It invites attack, but he's intending on that. In that middle, he puts his son, the Black Prince. He's not Black Prince yet, but he will become that, the Crown Prince. 16 years old, and his vanguard, and he puts his son in charge of the vanguard. So this is, to put it, make it a single word, it's bait, right? It's bait. Look, here's an opening in this field fortification. Oh yeah, and my son is right there. You capture him, and you end all of this, right? This is a prince's ransom. This is probably it for the entire conflict if you can just get that kid. And there he is with his banner flying right there. Come and get it. And the French coming onto this position, I believe, come on two different roads. I go into why this is in some detail in the book. But there's two roads to approach that position, and I think they're coming on both of them. So from the beginning, the French are in a sort of disorganized state. And when the fight begins, they first send in these Genoese crossbowmen. They don't know about the longbowmen. And these poor, poor guys are sent in. Crossbows take a lot longer to load than a longbow. And you're very exposed while doing so. So normally they have these man-sized shields called pavises that they'll kind of run out, set these down, and hunker behind them to load their crossbows. They're sent out without those because they don't think there's any danger. So they send them out without those. They don't have their helms on. They don't have their gorgets, which protect their necks. They're sitting ducks. They send them out to shoot at the English with crossbows. They get a shot off. The longbowmen and the English just hunker down behind the wagons, let the wood take the hits, and then stand up and shoot back. But the longbow has better range and can loose way faster, and so they come ranging down with all these arrows, and the Genoese flee. Unfortunately, in fleeing, they flee back the way that they came, which is where the second wave of French is coming, which is cavalry, which are meant to they've been softened up by crossbows, and here comes the cavalry to blast through. Well, when the cavalry comes running in, they steamroll into this fleeing Genoese crowd of crossbowmen. And horses and men colliding in lines does not make for order. It makes for chaos. The line dissolves into this jumbled mass, and the English can keep loosing their bows into them, which creates even more chaos. Right now, horses are getting hit with arrows, and they're going wild, and they're going crazy, and that's causing the other horse to go crazy. And it just becomes this domino of horror. And meanwhile, more French are streaming in, right? And they can't see what's happening. There's screams like, let's go in. And so you start getting wave after wave going in. And when it sort of turns, essentially at that point, Edward has this thing won. As long as you keep fighting me this way and I stay in position, I win. We only have so many arrows, but at that point, you guys are all pincushions. So, he's fine to stay this way. His son nearly loses the battle, though, because his son advances, leaves his position and advances to go into melee combat. It's one of the unknowns of what has happened is why does he do that? This is like the worst thing you could do, kid. But he does it. Kind of speculate. I mean, I assume that he just is, wants some glory, right? He's this kid. He's like, he sees these French lords getting cut down in front of him, and he's like, well, I want a piece of the action, and so he charges forward. But unfortunately, once you do that, once you're engaged in melee, now the archers can't just shoot willy-nilly into the crowd, because you don't want to be the Englishman who shot the Black Prince in the back of the noggin. Like, that's no good. So yeah, at that point, things get really perilous for the English side. And then the Black Prince is captured. And that's very different from the story I was told, and very different from the story that the English like to tell. So the English chroniclers say that the prince goes out, and other Englishmen are worried about it. And so they go to the king and they say, hey, can we charge in after him? And the King Edward is watching this whole battle from a windmill and says, no, let the boy earn his spurs. Let him become a knight. Let him become a man. Just no. He's a man. Let him do it. And they go anyway, according to the story, and go out and find the young man, 16 years old, lounging upon corpses, awaiting the next wave so he can cut them down too, because he's that much of a man, That's the traditional story. And the English tell, well, it has every appearance of being propaganda, spin. And what has actually happened was he went out, got too far ahead of the lines, was captured, was put on his knees. We have narrative eyewitness accounts of men who saw him go down on his knees, men who saw his standard bearer put the banner in front of him, saying, that is the prince, do not kill him, take him for ransom. He completely surrendered. But the French start fighting over who gets to claim ransom. And in that sort of struggle, a contingent of Englishmen, that contingent who goes in and supposedly finds him lounging, they did not. They found him surrendered, grabbed him and dragged him back to the English lines. It was probably the Bishop of Durham who led that charge. The Bishop of Durham was like, oh my God, ran out, rescued the kid, a little hostage rescue, dragged him back, and that Edward, far from being let the boy earn his spurs, that to the contrary, when he heard that his son had gone out too far, recognized immediately the danger, and got on his horse, had another part of the Wagenburg, this wooden fortification, if you will, opened up so he could ride out with a squad of men to try and save him himself. He knew the danger, but that the English wanted to sort of cover up all of that after the battle, and instead make this just nothing but glory, nothing but perfection, which makes sense, right? This is what we all do. This is inevitably what we do. And instead, what has happened is they nearly lost the dang thing, but they get him back. And from that point forward, as Philippe is losing more and more command and control, and they get the vanguard pulled back, you can just do arrows again. And it's over. They keep fighting. They keep killing until it's dark and they can't kill anymore. Philippe has left the field. Doesn't appear there was a call for a general retreat. They dragged the French king away from the field, and he didn't call for a retreat. So his men end up getting, dying all the way to nightfall. And the next day, another army shows up, doesn't know what happened to the first one, and they get wiped out too. It's a 2-day battle. Thousands and thousands die on that field, and not a very big area. It's a pretty small area where you can say all these thousands died. It's quite moving, to go there and know that and recognize that.
And it's quite a moving story as well, with so many different moving parts and interesting little storylines within it. Yeah. So thank you for bringing that to us. So I've got a final fun question for you, Michael, if I don't keep hitting the microphone. I've got a final fun question for you. You talk in your book about doing the same trip as an undergraduate and again as a professor. Now, I know there would have been certain locations that you would have visited as an undergraduate. Yeah. What was your favorite location that you revisited?
Oh, golly. Yeah, I mean, really, kind of what you're asking is like seeing it with different eyes, right? What a difference that makes. And to me, it was actually it's quite far afield. It's visiting the tomb of King John of Bohemia. So there were, the subtitle of my book is Battle of Five Kings. Obviously, we've talked about two: King of England, King of France. The King of Bohemia is also there, as is the King of Majorca, and the King of Bohemia's son, who has become King of the Romans. So you actually have five kings, four on one side, one on the other. And it's that one, Edward, of course, who wins big. King John of Bohemia is at this point really like the man. Like he's a veteran warrior of countless battles, sort of thing, but he's gone blind. One of our sources says he's gone chicken-eyed, which I continue to be very fascinated by what that is specifically trying to tell us, that he's chicken-eyed. But he's called Blind King John. And when I was an undergraduate, I went and visited his tomb in Luxembourg, in the cathedral there. And my professor, of course, had taught me Crecy. And so he talks about, the traditional account. And traditionally what happened at Crecy is that King John of Bohemia first says, when the position is described to him, he says, "We can't go in, we'll be the losers." The French go in anyway, and of course become losers. And when it's late in the day and it's clear this is no good, he says, "I need two of my men to volunteer to lead me into battle so that I can die in battle with a sword in my hand, rather than at home abed, having fled a battle." And two guys do volunteer to do this. And we have some amazing poetry and stuff from Bohemia, like in medieval Czech. We had some amazing stuff. It was really hard to find people to translate that. To talk about this and what this was like from the perspective of his men. He goes in and he does die. He does die with his sword in his hand. One of our sources talks about he probably killed more of his own men than of the enemy, because he was just wildly swinging his sword around willy-nilly, doesn't know what he's hitting. But he is killed. And I mean, it's a moving sort of thing, right? And so I saw the tomb as a student through that lens. Well, now I know and have the pictures. His tomb was opened, and he's in there. Remains are in there, mummified remains, and I include pictures of those mummified remains in the book. And the remains show, because they're sort of partially mummified, wounds, right? And of course, the bones show wounds, and so you can see the wounds that he took. So I mean, all I ever knew as a student was, he was killed. It's quite different to see how he was killed, right? The wounds that he took, and to understand what that must have been like, right, in a kind of real sense. And then to go back to his tomb and sort of like, okay, I know what you look like in there, right? I know what happened to you on that field, right? In a sort of horrible, twisted irony, probably the killing blow is somebody puts a dagger through his eye, which you probably didn't see coming. So I mean, I guess there's that. But horrible irony of history. But yeah, I mean, like to know what that is and the reality of what that guy, and near as we can tell, obviously, the reality of what he experienced, that was much different. So I'd say that was kind of like my favorite thing to revisit, because it felt so radically different to me now.
I think that's a lovely answer. I think that's a really, really nice answer, and bringing in so many different parts of King John. Then I think that's brilliant. Now, Obviously, people have listened to you talk about Crecy, Battle of Five Kings. I've got my copy here. I absolutely love it. So
Thank
where
you.
can people grab a copy of this and then find you and interact with your work online?
Yeah, so you can get Crecy pretty much. I think it just came out in paperback. So yeah, you can get Crecy. They're near as I can tell anybody. I mean, it's published ultimately by Bloomsbury. So any bookstore you want, you can find me online. My website is michaellivingston.com. But like I'm on Twitter, X, whatever it's called these days, Instagram, whatnot. Pretty easy to get a hold of. And if you're interested in this kind of thing. The previous book that I put out to Crecy was Never Greater Slaughter, which is about the Battle of Brunanburg. Does the same thing with that. And then the book I've put out since, well, one of the two books I've put out since, is Agincourt, Battle of the Scarred King, which does the Crecy treatment to Agincourt and says, okay, let's look at this battle now and let's see what we can glean from it. And it's very much, I mean, I modeled it on, it's very much the same thing, so, okay, here's the pieces of the puzzle. Forgetting what we all think happened, what did happen. So yeah, you can find me various places talking about all these various things. Yeah, I don't yet know where I'll be making appearances this summer, but I mean I'll be in Europe for a while, so I'll be around.
Well, I'll make sure a link for all of them is in the description below so people can go and grab themselves a coffee, but also interact with you in your other work. And we should get you back in the summer to discuss that new finding that you've got, because obviously we're not divulging it in this episode. But
yeah. I was like, sorry, I can't talk about it until it's published.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, Michael. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jackson. It was a wonderful conversation.
Now, thank you very much for listening to this newest episode of the History of Jackson podcast, where we spoke to Michael Livingston all about his book, Crecy, The Battle of Five Kings. Now, I'm sure you can agree that this conversation was absolutely riveting. We had so much up-to-date history brought to us in an accessible and digestible way, as we always try to do here at History of Jackson. And it was great to have some misconceptions possibly corrected by Michael's working theory on where the location of the Battle of Crecy is. Now, if you enjoy this episode or any of the other episodes that we have here at History of Jackson, or any other content that we create here at History of Jackson, please do consider heading to the Buy Me a Coffee profile in the description below, or heading to History of Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts, where you can support us. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you all next week, where we have another awesome episode lined up.